So what's funny is like all the quantum fudsters, like the people who are like, oh, Bitcoin's over because quantum, like Willow or something, is like they're just like totally full of shit. Like there's like we have a plan. We have 80% of coins are not vulnerable. Like there's not a lot of reason to be super concerned. Like there's no way quantum computers will kill Bitcoin. I don't think there's cause to worry. Well, I'll tell you who is concerned, like really very concerned about this quantum threat to the point where there's laying out roadmaps and deadlines and like we need to be ready by this date. And that's the US government. They have a specific date in which they want to phase out elliptic curve cryptography entirely, which is the year 2035. They also have like roadmaps towards the transition to post-quantum cryptography. So if we want Bitcoin to be at least as secure as the government expects their own systems to be, then we basically have 5 to 10 years. You know, like if you're just looking at the writing on the wall, if you're just looking at what the government is doing, then it's pretty clear that they know something we don't.
Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I'm Charlie Spears with Blockspace Media. We have an interesting topic today. You know, everybody in the world is talking about quantum computing after the Google Willow chip announcement in the past week or two. And that means that we are also talking about how does quantum computing maybe affect or find some parts of Bitcoin vulnerable. This could mean up to 1 million or so of Satoshi's Bitcoin that they mined back in the day, and maybe even your Bitcoin, depending on their security. And because this is such a deep and technical topic, I have hit up our connection, Hunter Beast, a Coloradan Bitcoin dev, to help explain this. Hunter has written a BIP, which does not have yet a number, but it's one of the ones I think out there doing the best work, feet on the pavement, actually talking about solutions to a potential Bitcoin vulnerability. But before any of that, a word from our sponsor. Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Botanix. Botanix Labs is pioneering a new direction for DeFi with the first EVM L2 running on Bitcoin that's built to be forward secure, decentralized, and share gas fees generated by the network with users. See the future of DeFi at Botanix, botanixlabs.xyz. All right, I'm going to bring Hunter up. Hunter, thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2. How are you doing?
Oh, geez. Got a lot of irons in the fire. So just been really productive. And when I'm productive, I'm happy. So, yeah.
Same. I mean, you've kind of become a bit of like the voice for the Bitcoin and quantum narrative right now, but you have multiple irons in the fire. I think you've got the Ducat stablecoin project. What other things are you involved in?
Yeah, so one thing that is a more recent development is I'm going to be joining Mara as a protocol engineer.
Ooh, I didn't know that. That's a big announcement. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And one reason they wanted me to join was because of the work that I'm doing on quantum resistance. And in particular, they want to deploy a sidechain that employs that. But we haven't really announced too many details on that. So more on that soon.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about that. Maybe we repick that conversation up again whenever you guys are further along with that. So I kind of said, like, you know, I have a bit of a hybrid audience here, and a lot of people have no idea about anything to do with quantum, and frankly, I think a lot of people lack even a basic understanding of Bitcoin, even if they own a lot of Bitcoin. And these two things are kind of difficult to explain. So my thought is we start out with some kind of high level, like simplified, like talking points. And then I can let you take the gloves off and go deeper into some of the obscure technicalities of this. So let's first of all go back to like what kicked off this most recent narrative, which is Google CEO Sundar Pichai tweeted and announced their Willow chip. It said it's a quantum breakthrough, and we saw a bunch of people have different takes on it. What is your take on the Google chip news, and maybe put in context of the bigger quantum discussion?
Yeah. So up until this point, it really does feel like we've been working with sort of like early quantum computing, in that it's basically like the vacuum tubes and relay computers of old, right? Like of the 1940s and 50s. We're using mercury delay lines and that sort of thing. If you know your old computing history,
like the old Alan Turing computer from the movie, that kind of thing, that old style.
Like lots of wires and lots of physical components that you can touch with your hands, and often have to service, right? So like one of the earliest computers was called the ANFSQ7, and it was a military computer that used about 10 or 20,000 different vacuum tubes, and it had to be serviced every now and then. Like you had to go into the computer and replace certain parts. And you see people doing this with quantum computers, where they actually have to take out the cover of it and go in and play with the wires. And it just reminds me so much of like the old, approaches towards computing back in the 40s and 50s. And so the reason I bring that up is because it really does seem a lot like the Willow development is essentially the point where we went from using vacuum tubes to the point where we have a transistor, like William Shockley's innovation, right, of an actual like PNP junction. And this is still like something that like goes in like a little tin can, and it's like early transistors are about this big, and they had 3 wires coming out of them. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is I think we went from, having a certain amount of qubits up to 105 qubits now. And those 105 qubits can work together using what are called error correction codes to act as a single unit, where it goes from being physical qubits to a logical qubit. And that's when things start getting a little interesting, because then all it is a scaling problem. And we've gotten really good at putting transistors on chips and details on chips. These are qubits, for example, are held in what are called Josephson junctions, but that's also getting into the weeds. So
yeah, well, that's getting the weeds. So it's kind of like we're going from the vacuum tubes to the what I think modern day hardware still kind of uses, which is types of transistors.
Right.
I also, you also say error correction, and does this get into the topic of like noise when,
right.
Like talking about quantum? This might be another kind of good follow up to explain this concept of noise when talking about quantum computing.
Right. So any little thing like a vibration or like a radio wave, things like that, they all have to be kind of isolated from the external environment. And that's one reason why the chips have to be cooled to super cool temperatures, basically almost as close as we get to absolute zero, colder than space. And so essentially noise is a product of external vibrations, could be external phenomena, radio waves, that sort of thing. And they can cause an entangled circuit to decohere. They call it decoherence. And so what makes quantum computers special is that they're able to entangle these quantum bits together to the point where they share the same state until they're read. And then when they're read out, there's like a collapse of the wave function, basically, which is a term that's borrowed from multiverse theory. And in the latest Google Willow paper, they said that this basically affirms the notion that quantum computers exist within a multiverse, and they parallelize computation across multiple universes, and then the most likely solution collapses into like the actual what we read, the result that we read from the chip. And so the more qubits you get, especially the more logical qubits you get, you can start modeling complex systems like elliptic curve cryptography. And in particular, you don't even need to model the entire process of turning a private key to a public key. Instead, you're going from a public key to a private key. And the way it does this is that it searches through this what they call Hilbert space, which is like the whole problem space of every potential possibility. And then the quantum computer is able to arrive at like a close enough solution. And so long as we can check to see if that number goes back to a public key and it matches the public key, then you found the private key. And so that's a huge problem for elliptic curve cryptography, because it relies on this assumption that doing that particular thing is quite hard, quite computationally expensive. And unfortunately, quantum computers kind of break that rule. They're able to optimize these problems to the point where they are solvable within days or hours or minutes.
We're going to come back to this concept of like a quantum computer breaking elliptic curve cryptography and how that applies to Bitcoin. I think I want to again talk about quantum at a high level and just talk about it, the urgency with which we should or shouldn't actively look at solutions or mitigations to things that quantum would break. Like, how urgent is it that we start talking about quantum? Like, I've heard people be critical of this, saying, "Well, it's never going to happen. Quantum's a LARP. This is not really a thing we need to be concerned with." But yet, it seems to me that there is some material reason, like, why we should be discussing this. Like, could we wake up next week and see that like something about Bitcoin or just cryptography in general is broken from quantum? What's your take on this?
Well, I'll tell you who is concerned, like really very concerned about this quantum threat, to the point where there's laying out roadmaps and deadlines and like, we need to be ready by this date. And that's the US government. And they have a specific date in which they want to phase out elliptic curve cryptography entirely. And they also have which is the year 2035. They also have roadmaps towards the transition to post-quantum cryptography. They sort of go from like 2029 to 2032. And so if we want Bitcoin to be at least as secure as the government expects their own systems to be, then we basically have 5 to 10 years to catch up. And I think what, like if you're just looking at the writing on the wall, if you're just looking at what the government is doing, then it's pretty clear that they know something we don't. And they've been working on this problem too in parallel. I've met engineers who work for Raytheon who are working on the quantum problem. This is a defense prime contractor. And there's also a company called In-Q-Tel, you may have heard of. They're essentially the private branch of the CIA, and they invest in quantum computing projects all the time, like Rigetti and IonQ. And so, there's definitely a lot of, they call it spooky action at a distance. This is just spook action right here, like right at home. And I'm just saying that like there are there are things that neither of us have the need to know, and unfortunately, like we as civilians, we really just can't know, and for whatever reason, for better or worse, and as a result, really the point I'm trying to make is that if the government is worried, then we should be worried.
So let's get into how this applies to Bitcoin, because one of the great responses, well, if quantum breaks Bitcoin, then it breaks a lot of other things too. And yeah, that's true. I think it's important. It's an important point to make. But I want to try to flesh out and qualify and differentiate the different ways that quantum could challenge different parts of Bitcoin. I think you actually do this pretty well in your proposal, because I think a lot of people just kind of say quantum as this big boogeyman, and it's just this one single dimension type thing. But when we get into how it would actually break certain components of Bitcoin, then I think we can have a productive conversation about this. Can you describe maybe the different ways or dimensions that quantum could challenge, or the different dimensions that Bitcoin may be vulnerable to quantum computing?
Yeah, so there's two ways that we know that Bitcoin is vulnerable. One is the hash function SHA-256, or as it's used in proof of work, double SHA-256. That actually doesn't complicate things much further. If it's just hashed twice over, it might add a little bit more complexity, but it's really the number of bits is what you're worried about. And 256 is quite a few bits, actually, when we're talking about hash functions. There's an algorithm called Grover's algorithm, and it can essentially reverse the inputs to the black box function to a black box function. And so it's if you imagine SHA-256 as a black box function where it has inputs like the pre-image of the block template and the header and that sort of thing, and then you have the number with a bunch of zeros, then there might be a way to optimize that with either Grover's or another algorithm called BHT that allows you to come up with the hash collisions, basically. And so that said, Grover's, and BHT is based on Grover's, these algorithms don't scale very well. Whenever you add another bit, it's certainly it's an improvement over what a classical computer would need to do. But as far as quantum computers go, it's a more computationally intensive algorithm to deploy than what's needed to break elliptic curve cryptography, which is a completely separate thing. Hash functions are considered to be more computationally expensive for quantum computers to break, and as a result, they also are considered to be more quantum resistant hashes. Whereas, and let's also acknowledge another thing about proof of work. When people say, will quantum computing break Bitcoin? And people are like, well, no, proof of work, a 51% attack still requires an extraordinary amount of computing power. And quantum computers aren't going to be so efficient that they're going to just completely displace all of the hash at once. And so instead, what will probably happen is miners will augment their fleets with quantum ASICs or something like it, and they'll just upgrade. It'll just be an upgrade function, and that's true. That's a common point I've heard against quantum computing, and it's no, they're not wrong. That's probably going to be how it plays out. But before that,
what I hear is a quantum ASICs. So we've got the S19 S21, and then we're talking like an S100, and it's the Bitmain's Pioneer Quantum ASIC. This is the reductionist future, which actually is pretty cool to me. So,
it's meant to be deployed in vacuum on the moon.
Yeah,
so
that's where we get the whole space mining idea,
right? Well, like space mining doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense because there's like
this
the thermal.
Might be out of scope, but I know. Yeah, the
thermals of that is more difficult because not only do you have to collect your energy from solar rays, but you also have to radiate it, and so any energy you get in, you have to put out in space. However, on the moon, that's a different story. You can actually do what's called selenothermal heat rejection. So it's like kind of like geothermal, but on the moon, and you can just have water coolant loops, just like injecting heat down into the lunar soil, and also heat is also quite a bit of a commodity on the moon. Also, we've had like lunar rovers like just break because they get too cold. So
yeah. Well, Hunter, this is out of scope. We gotta get back. We gotta get back to the quantum.
Well, off-worlding hash rate is going to be a thing.
Okay, so to hand wave, like Bitcoin mining really not for the foreseeable future, like of significant cause for concern in a quantum. We don't consider it as quantum vulnerable, but you're talking about the cryptography that secures a lot of Bitcoin, the public-private key cryptography. Let's do an explain like I'm 5 version. You have explained it a couple times already, but like I want to try to for the listener who really doesn't know like the whole, they know they've got their seed phrase, right? And they're like, I've got my seed phrase, I've got my Bitcoin, I'm self-custodying. Like let's say the user knows that part, but what do you like? Explain what you're talking about when we talk about quantum could break this cryptography.
Yeah. So to get from your seed phrase to an address, for example, these are like two things that Bitcoiners are quite familiar with at a high level. To get from a seed phrase to a address, you need to go through this whole process of, first of all, the seed phrase goes through what's called a password-based key derivation function, and it basically hashes the shit out of your your words, and then it'll result in a number, and this number will then put it through. This is going from what's called BIP39 to BIP32, and BIP32 basically specifies how you take this number, the seed that you get from the PBKDF, to go into what's called a HMAC, or a hash message authentication function, and that is a 512-bit number. And so then you go from that HMAC to essentially something called hierarchical deterministic key derivation. And this is then using what's called a descriptor. And a descriptor includes like the network, whether it's testnet or mainnet, what account you're using on your hardware device, and then also whether your address that you're generating is going to be used for receive or change. And then finally, the address index, which is at what point in what list of Blue Wallet will show you sometimes a list of all the different addresses your wallet generates. And
Sparrow's really good at this, and this is also similar for the ordinals folks. When you have your Xverse and you keep creating new wallets, those are just addresses. They're in the same, by the same private key. So you're talking about that kind of mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. And so each one of those then gets hashed again, and this hash is then this is actually the private key. And then when you go from the in order to go from a private key to a public key, you need to multiply it by in a certain way, in a specific way. But this is defined in what's called the SEC P256K1 signature algorithm. And this is a specification for elliptic curve cryptography. And there's like a group for actually developing this, and that's where the SecP comes from. And then 256 is the number of bits of security that this elliptic curve cryptography provides, and then K1 stands for what's called Kublitz curve, and so this is basically the fact that the parameters for the elliptic curve are calculated in a way that seems mathematically sound, whereas there's another version of SecP which is called SecP256R1, and it's also known as P256, I think, and it uses suspiciously picked, like what they call random constants.
Finger quotes for listeners. He's saying finger quotes random.
Right.
Yeah.
Finger quotes random constants. And these may have been chosen in advance by organizations like the NSA. And so, and what's so funny is that like no web browser uses SecP256K1. It's not NIST approved. It's not like standardized. It is like this, like it exists in sort of like this, like, how would you say? It's like even kind of, excluded by cryptographers like Daniel J. Bernstein, and so he's a well-known cryptographer who worked on some cryptography for Google, and he also later worked on a post-quantum cryptography signature algorithm called Sphinx, and so he knows his stuff, and he ranks SecP256K1 slightly lower on his Safe Curves website than, his favorite algorithm, which is based on the Edwards curve, ED25519. And this elliptic curve is often used for like encrypted communications, like Signal uses it, and at least, and also I think Monero uses it, or some version of it. But it's kind of like a favored by cryptographers, whereas SecP256K1 kind of stands on its own as like this unique curve that nobody uses, that's not standardized, that Satoshi picked, and for some reason it just kind of it's stuck with Bitcoin. It's worked pretty well so far. And so I think that that's an interesting background for like why we use this algorithm. And what's interesting about like the transition to post-quantum cryptography is that NIST has been leading these rounds of communication, and so of like evaluating these post-quantum cryptography algorithms, and they're often kind of it requires a very specialized cryptographer to understand the mechanisms behind it, the mathematics behind it, how it differs a great deal from like there's a number of different approaches based on either hashes or lattices or lattice cryptography. There's even newer stuff called super singular elliptic curve isogenies, and isogeny fields are basically like higher order elliptic curves, and they use what's called a quaternion to encapsulate these like signatures and public keys. And so and we in the BIP we've sort of picked from there's dozens of these algorithms under development or that have been developed, and in the BIP we've essentially chosen 4. We've narrowed it down to 4 based on various criteria, and some of these are controversial, some are less controversial. Some of them are like use more memory, use more space on the blockchain, and they also use more computational power. But conversely, some are more experimental. One of them is not even approved by NIST just yet, and so it really is like we don't know for sure what'll be the gold standard, and also what is the best for use with Bitcoin. And so that's what we have 4, and we're essentially going to let the market decide what they want to use and what they want to spend to secure transactions.
So you started out explaining like I was 5, and you ended up explaining like I was a doctorate in in quantum. But like this is pretty interesting because you say basically we have to figure out a different hashing function which is quantum resistant to secure
a different signature algorithm. Actually, it's different. Okay. Yeah. So like hashing functions are SHA-256 is actually pretty decent as far as post quantum cryptography is concerned. It's the problem is that there's this other algorithm called Shor's algorithm, SHOR, that can be used to essentially provide the reverse of a public key. That's the simplest way I can put it. And
gotcha.
It does this by factoring numbers, basically, where there's something called the discrete log problem, and essentially it says that it is hard for classical computers to factor the original numbers that were used to multiply into a very large number. And so there's a lot of information lost there whenever you multiply 2 big numbers. And so finding the original number, especially if it's as large as 256 bits, which is a number that's larger than the number of atoms in the known universe, then finding that like the private key that corresponds to a public key is actually highly improbable and very difficult to find if you're brute forcing, unless you have some other optimization mechanism.
Yeah. But with quantum, we could theoretically, depending on the signature algorithm, could reverse engineer that. I use the term reverse engineer. Is that even a useful definition in this case?
Yeah, I mean, like, I haven't heard of a good nomenclature that is standardized for that process. I could look into it more, but basically, for lack of a better way of putting it, it's just like finding the original private key to a public key. So you can kind of consider it as reversing that function.
Okay, so that gets us into some of the meat and potatoes of like what specifically your BIP and what specifically is at risk for Bitcoin, and then gets into exactly what you're proposing. You are saying there are certain signature algorithms, there are certain types Bitcoin held in certain addresses or by certain public keys, which are more vulnerable to quantum computing. You call them cryptographically relevant quantum computers, or CQR?
Crypto-analytically, yeah.
Crypto-analytically relevant quantum computers, and you say we at least can with high probability say that these Bitcoin held in these addresses is probably more vulnerable, and you're saying we can upgrade through a soft fork the cryptography used to generate addresses so that it is theoretically quantum secure not vulnerable given our understanding of cryptography. Can you give me a little more insight and context on the what Bitcoin is vulnerable and why? I think you said there, I'm looking at the BIP, you had, I think, 4 types of addresses. Can you explain those a little bit?
Yeah. So there's 4 different address types that we've outlined that we basically explained. Some are safe or some are vulnerable. And then there's also 4 different scenarios in Bitcoin where essentially a public key may be exposed. And so whenever a public key is exposed, that's when we're in the danger zone. And so early addresses were essentially a public key encoded as the locking script, or what they call the script pub key. But that essentially is like the entire public key, all 65 bytes of it, available for anybody with a quantum computer powerful enough to take the funds in those addresses. Then there's Taproot, which is far more recent, but it's 32 byte X only public key. And so it's kind of like just the X coordinate, but it's easy enough to find the Y coordinate that corresponds with the X coordinate. And so it might as well be, for all intents and purposes, a fully exposed public key as well. And that said, there are public key hash addresses, and those are considered quantum resistant because, as I said earlier, hashes are considered quantum resistant. And so, to some degree at least. And so there's 2 more common of the public key hash address types. There's the ones that start with the number 1 and have just a bunch of alphabetical number letters encoding. It's called base 58 encoding. And this is also known as a legacy address. And then there's also native SegWit addresses. They start with BC1Q and have a much more limited character set of 32 characters. And so they look kind of different. They don't have capital letters, for example. And those are safe.
Gotcha. So, for anyone who's listening, who's kind of made it this far, they've trudged through some of the technical discourse. Give me a one-liner, which is so how much Bitcoin is at risk?
About, it could be somewhere between 2 to 4 million coins.
Which would be 10 to 20% of Bitcoin. A lot, the lion's share of which is probably Satoshi's, mined by Satoshi, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which will get us into, I think, a good way to wrap this up. But I want to go into, you talked about taking Bitcoin in these public key hash addresses and again kind of reversing
not the public key hash addresses.
The legacy addresses.
Mm-hmm. And the legacy addresses are fine. It's anything that has the public key exposed. So that would be the pay to taproot, and that would be the pay to public key, the very old addresses.
Yes, pay to public key. Correct. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. Okay. So pay to public key. That would be a lot of Satoshi's Bitcoin. We can probably quantum computers could derive a private key from that. That would be a long range attack. I hadn't really considered. I wasn't aware of this short range attack model until I read through your BIP. Can you explain what a short range attack is? Because I think that might help differentiate additionally.
Yeah, so there's 4 scenarios in which your public key is exposed. One is if you're using a very old address from 2010 or so. If you're using pay to taproot addresses, to secure coins. It's not a good idea because the public key is there. Then there's also whenever you spend your coins, they enter the mempool, and whenever your transaction's in the mempool and it hasn't been confirmed yet, that's going to be a period of time where a quantum computer with sufficient power, this is like a much more powerful quantum computer than is needed to get at Satoshi's coins, then it might be able to redirect where your transaction's going, but that we haven't seen that kind of attack just yet. I don't believe. We can't really know for sure, but we're not quite in that territory yet. It's also unclear if it's been done with any of early coins, certainly not to Satoshi's coins, because we noticed that there's a sort of pattern that his coins kind of follow. Though this is somewhat controversial, but a lot of people acknowledge that the Satoshi pattern is how we can identify which coins were Satoshi's, and we haven't seen those coins move just yet. But there's also some game theory involved in just like if you had a quantum computer, what do you do with it and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And also if the government has a quantum computer, they're probably going to have a different idea of how to use it than, a civilian quantum computer. And so there's a number of considerations there, but ultimately the third case where you expose your public key is when it enters the mempool, and then finally the fourth scenario that a public key will be exposed is once that the transaction is confirmed. If basically you've already exposed your public key, it's in the signature now, so it's used to validate the transaction, and the big concern now is if you were to ever spend, if you were to reuse that address and by essentially receiving funds to it, spending from it, and it gets confirmed from the mempool, if you use the old address again, then that public key is already known, and so that address is not quite safe to use at that point. And it's also not a good idea from a privacy standpoint because that associates additional outputs with the same address. So it's kind of like providing more information to chain and analysis. And so Bitcoiners are generally pretty good about address use because we've been told from basically the get-go by Satoshi not to reuse addresses. And so it's interesting how like that early guidance and also the default of where Satoshi's coins go kind of prepared us in some ways for the advent of quantum computing. What I mean by that is, and I don't know if you want to go into this, but is basically Satoshi's coins serve a useful purpose during a quantum transition, which is essentially to make so like every Satoshi's coins weren't all in one single address. There's not like one big honeypot. There's about 34,000 different addresses where they have about an average balance of about 50 Bitcoin each. And that was the early block reward. And from Epoch 1 or Epoch 0, I think we just call it Epoch 1. Yeah, so
the first epoch.
Yeah, let's just call it that. And so and what's interesting is that because they're all spread out, it will take a quantum computer some time to get through them. And for anybody transferring less than 50 Bitcoin worth of value in a single address, then they're kind of shielded, at least from a crypto economic standpoint, by the fact that there are other coins that are more valuable, that are sort of like a more valuable use of their limited quantum computing time to attack than they would be to attack your coins.
So that there's just a bigger, so that it kind of like insulates us or gives us a little bit of a warning ahead of time, because Satoshi's created a bigger honeypot for a quantum computer than my own pitiful 2,000 Satoshi stack output.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's also funny is that like things like ordinals are probably also kind of exempt, or runes, because they're on these like dust outputs that don't, have a lot of value from like an on-chain standpoint. So like if some like those will probably be some of the last attacked.
Well, you say that, but I'll provide a counterpoint here, which is ordinals people tend to reuse addresses the most and tend to do pay to taproot.
Yep.
And so that would require that a quantum computer or a quantum attacker be ordinals aware and have awareness of secondary market pricing, so they could see, well, there might only be 50 outputs, each worth 546 sats.
Yeah, but by the time we're at that point, like they're going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel. Basically, they're going to be trying to extract value from other ways than just taking coins that are on chain.
I'm just imagining a scenario where a quantum computer is trying to like look at the secondary market pricing of like a Bitcoin puppet and being like, well,
quantum cat.
Quantum cat. We could attack Satoshi's coins, or we could get this big quantum cat's whale address.
Yeah.
There have been, I think, some people who have floated. This is where we get into the two controversial things about quantum, which is various approaches to Satoshi's coins and your quantum witness data discount topic. Let's do the Satoshi coins one first, which is some people have said, okay, well, what if we see Satoshi's coins move? Now, this is not just in the context of a quantum computer, it's also in the context of other scenarios, but like some people have suggested various things along a spectrum of like how permissionless and open do we feel Bitcoin? Some people have said, well, the community Handwave could just refuse to accept or spend those coins. I don't know. What do you think of, have you seen, I guess my actual question is, have you seen any compelling proposals which don't sound insane for handling how Satoshi's quantum exposed coins?
Well, as I said before, like Satoshi's coins serve a useful purpose. So if we were to compromise their capability to be spent, then that just like tightens it makes it sort of harder for plebs to transition. It just gives them less time, and so I'm opposed to it from that reason alone. But also, people have just said that it has a sort of confiscatory, like heavy-handed, like approach towards solving that problem. And actually, what's funny is that Vitalik's solution for Ethereum basically involves that. Like, not only do they want to like hard fork Ethereum to the point where this is like before the quantum emergency, so they're just going to reverse all the transactions till they realize like to the point where before they realize that funds have been taken. But also they want to disable all the private key, basically every private key. Like if you use a private key to access your funds, then like a JSON file or something, like old school, before they had seeds, like mnemonic seeds for MetaMask and stuff, then you're kind of SOL. And so like a lot of smart contracts, a lot of bridges, like it's going to be a whole freaking mess. And yeah,
that sounds a lot to me like very reminiscent of the ETH DAO hack, I think in 2016, which is like, oh, well, shoot. Well, we can socially coordinate this out. We're going to roll things back just because that stinks. Whereas you and I would say probably most Bitcoiners would say, well, that's just how it is. We're pretty we're diehard to the openness of the system.
Right.
And
like ultimately, it's not your keys, not your coins. That's like the fundamental rule of Bitcoin. And so if somebody else is able to get your keys, then there's been some miss. There's been a failure in operational security somewhere. And so and of course, like this one additional complication, operational security, is quantum computing. And so, if there's like one thing that viewers or listeners should understand, is that they should keep their coins in native SegWit addresses, which are hashed public keys, and they should never reuse an address. And if there is a period of quantum emergency, ideally they have fewer than 50 Bitcoin per address or per wallet, because wallets oftentimes consolidate UTXOs and consolidate addresses into exchange outputs that could be larger than 50 Bitcoin if you're so well capitalized. But finally, if you are caught with your proverbial pants down, then essentially what you need to do is you need to take your transaction where you're spending you're moving your coins to a new quantum resistant address format that we've specified in the BIP called pay to quantum resistant hash, or P2QRH. Starts with BC1R. And we wanted to start with R because it looks like it's resistant, so it's easy to tell that this is a resistant address. And if you're going from, if you're moving your transaction, you have to take it. You basically have to take it directly to a miner you trust. That's not going to try to take your coins, but instead is just going to mine your transaction in a private mempool that they're going to insert your transaction into a block that they have the right to mine, and then it'll be mined in this block, and then your public key will have been exposed, but the coins will have already been spent to a safe address, and so then you're good and clear, barring any kind of reorg activity. But yeah, so which is usually quite rare. So ultimately, I think miners will have a big part to play in the transition. Just there might even be like fraud proofs that people will try to create around transactions that have been submitted to mining pools, so that you can detect and prove if a transaction you submitted has essentially been taken from you by a mining pool that's sharing your transactions with a quantum attacker. And so we've definitely thought through like all these different scenarios, but like ideally the ideal scenario is that we get ahead of this eventuality, and we just be very well prepared for deploying a soft fork, if not already having one activated by this point, and then people will start moving their coins to the new address type. Whether this will happen, it's hard to say, but one thing I can say is that two of the biggest people the two stakeholder classes that have the most to lose from a quantum emergency are going to be exchanges and investors, and mining pools and miners. And so, because oftentimes miners will reuse addresses, they'll mine to the same address all the time, and also these exchanges, cold wallets, like Binance is a cold wallet that has 250,000 Bitcoin in it that they've already spent from. And so, and oftentimes these exchanges will post these addresses as sort of a proof of reserve, so that people know they have the coins there. But the problem is it's also a huge honeypot for quantum computing. Though, you might not take those coins to begin with because you don't want people to know you have a quantum computer just yet. So you don't want to take the market and that sort of thing. So the only problem with using a quantum computer right now also is that you have no safe place to put your coins. So it's kind of like one of those things where like we are definitely very early and to this, which is good. It's a good place to be right now. We're not scrambling. We're preparing. We have a plan. We have at least one plan that's hopefully viable. And so we're working towards it. There's a few other plans out there, but they're not quite as complete or well discussed. And yeah, so we're like, there's sort of like there is cause to worry from like an existential standpoint, but so long as you practice the right sort of like operational security around your addresses, and you're also just not doing anything too risky, then you should be fine, even after quantum emergencies. Because these little guidelines here and there that you just try to abide by just in case there is a big problem someday. So what's funny is like all the quantum fudsters, like the people who are like, oh, Bitcoin's over because quantum, like Willow or something, is like you're just like totally full of shit. Like there's like we have a plan. We have 80% of coins are not vulnerable. Like there's like there's not a lot of reason to be super concerned. Like there's no way quantum computers will kill Bitcoin. Like Bitcoin is anti-fragile, and it secures $2 trillion of value right now. And so there's not going to be a point where we're not going to like just do our best to get ahead of any kind of major threat to Bitcoin. So that's ultimately, I don't think there's cause to worry, but there is, good reason. There are good reasons to just want to get ahead of this whole scenario and ideally be proactive. But even if we're not proactive, that's fine too, because we have Satoshi Shield. And so, like there's just ultimately it's not going to be as bad as people think it will be.
Well, maybe instead of the quantum witness discount, because that's a little bit too big of I think it might be too big of a topic to bite off for this podcast. I might throw this back at you because I think you characterize it pretty well. Like, not terribly worried about quantum being this existential threat, but you say you advocate for being proactive about solving or addressing things around it. This gets into what I like to ask, I think, technical Bitcoiners at the end of each show, which is this gets into the bigger conversation of soft forks in general. And you seem to be advocating for a proactive approach to soft fork discussion, ideation. But I hear a lot of people say we should be reactive. I had a conversation last night which went something to the tune of like, well, there's not a lot of activity. There doesn't seem to be a lot of demand for Bitcoin self-custody. Why would we pursue a soft fork towards a covenant which would improve the custodial self-custody experience and landscape? We can do that when we come to it. But that's one view of, I would say, reactive forking. What are your thoughts on this? And does your proactivity limit itself to just quantum, or thoughts on soft forks in general?
Well, there's two sides of it, right? One is like Bitcoin is securing $2 trillion worth of value. So if we're going to mess with it, we better have a damn good reason, right? There's also the other side of it where Bitcoin is securing $2 trillion worth of value, but it could be securing far more value if we had these covenants, if we had this kind of like trustless approach towards self-custody and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if I buy that argument so much, but what I do buy is the argument that Bitcoin's quantum vulnerability is probably going to be a barrier to adoption by nation states and big investors. It oftentimes comes up in their quarterly reports, as like a risk that they are considering. I think MicroStrategy even mentioned it in one of their recent reports. And so, it's definitely a thing on people's minds. And if we don't have a good solution for it, then it'll definitely be like a barrier to adoption. And so, there's that reason for being proactive. But that said, I'm also sympathetic to the reactive people's camps because, I want Bitcoin to be successful. I don't want us to accidentally shoot ourselves in the foot at the last mile here towards, full hyper Bitcoinization, 15 years in, going on 16 years now. And so, I think it's important to have a measured approach to this and not be freaking out, just be doing our best to prepare and have the tools ready when they're necessary or when the community decides they're necessary. But ultimately, we'll hopefully have ways to field this technology ahead of time, so that we'll be able to have wallets be prepared to build all this in, and it'll just be ready to move over once that occurs. So although as the BIP author, I advocate for its activation. I'm not gonna be fear mongering or pushing this actively as a thing people should be guilted into doing, right? No, there are good reasons for and against, and a lot of people who are against are maybe just against right now. So it's not the hard no, not on my node, that kind of thing. So and I also just want people to understand that I'm not trying to force changes on Bitcoin. I'm not trying to get no attack on Bitcoin territory. I'm just trying to offer a solution should it ever be needed.
I think there's many people like that who they love Bitcoin. They want to improve it. They have a specific thing and vision that they think that they can provide, and they try to release it out in the wild. And a lot of us get bogged down by our own personalities or other people's personalities. Such is kind of the case and a bit of the curse of being totally engaged in the Bitcoin discourse.
We're all ultimately financial doomsday preppers, right? We have this doomsday scenario in mind, which is hyper Bitcoinization. It's had that name for a long time now, and we're just preparing for that possibility or that eventuality or that inevitability based on, what we understand of the debt spiral and things like that. And so unfunded liabilities and the dollar milkshake theory, just it all kind of pointing to the fact that the dollar could die one day. And Bitcoin is basically the ideal, in my opinion, the ideal solution to that. And not everything about Bitcoin is ideal, but it is the best we have so far. Let's just say that. And as a result of us being kind of doomsday preppers and trying to envision this potential future, we also have to be aware that there are nation states working very actively towards breaking the technology that Bitcoin uses, and for whatever reason, not just to break Bitcoin, but they're just building this technology as a sort of arms race, and so. It is important to have your doomsday prepper hat on, conspiracy theory hat sometimes, and just to be a little paranoid because they say only the paranoid survive.
Very well put, Hunter. I thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2, and I don't think this is the last time. I'm pretty sure we'll have another episode at another major point in 2025. Where can people find you and continue the conversation?
Yeah, so you can find me on X. I'm at CryptoQuick. You can also find me on Noster. My npub is npub QQQ. No, and then also you can find me on Noster on my X. And also on my website, cryptoquick.com. And you can ultimately, please donate if you can, if you think this is like a useful endeavor. We have a website, surmount.systems. This is sort of the outfit and foundation that we're working on building this BIP under. I have two other people who I regularly bounce ideas off of in this organization, and we're just trying our best to, come up with good solutions ahead of time. And so if you think this work that we're doing is valuable, we have a silent payments address and we have a Bolt 12 address, and also accept zaps and things like that. So, like price signals matter, right? Like if people really truly think this is valuable, then please, incentivize us to put more of our time towards it.
Cool. Thanks so much, Hunter. I'll see you in 2025.
All right. Thank you.